way, a different way that the science makes me feel. So the emotions are wonder, anger, guilt, fear, grief, surprise, pride, hope, and love. And so I'm going to start with a reading from the grief chapter, toward the end of the chapter. If you're lucky, you'll lose your grandparents before you go. Then you'll watch your own parents meander into old age, losing their agility, then their sharpness, then language and memory. Your children will watch your descent in turn after you've said goodbye to fat baby cheeks and pudgy hands, seen them grow tall and angular and surly, and watched them leave you forever. As we become old, we accumulate layers of disaster, small and large, invisible mirrors of the fossilized death preserved under our feet. The happiest life is shot through with sadness, glimmers of unbearable grief shining cold and hard in the light like crystals of quartz and smooth granite. The planet, like us, has lost much before, but never quite like this. This loss is everywhere. It's fast, it's inevitable, it's sad in a way I can't describe, an inaudible crack and an invisible surface, the breaking of billions of hearts all at once. The world we love is being snatched away from us before its time. Stop all the clocks, you think, after something you loved is gone. But they never do stop. Time does not pause to mourn. It fails over and over to come to a halt. Disrespectful, heedless, insistent on filling the void with something new. Life goes on, but this doesn't mean nothing has been lost. The second reading is from the Hope chapter.
We'll say you're 11. That way you only have to pay half price.
Somebody's off mute there, but I'll plow ahead. Is there any hope? This is the question I'm asked most of all, over and over, by frightened young people and despairing old ones. I understand why, now that we live amid the fast accumulating wreckage of climate-fueled disasters, made worse by indifferent, ineffective, or hostile governments. We clearly have the hope of preventing climate change. Sorry to hear. The world is 1.3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution. It will get hotter still. We will not get a fairy tale ending, maybe not even a tolerably happy one. Hope is difficult to cling to in these circumstances, and in the carnage on the news or outside my window, I sometimes feel it slip away. Fine then. Abandon all hope. We have something much better. Certainty. We are more sure that greenhouse gases are warming the planet than we are that smoking causes cancer. There's no mystery here, no supernatural force, no asteroid hurtling toward us that we are powerless to stop. We know that greenhouse gases cause climate change. To stop the planet warming, we simply have to stop emitting them. The science is also clear about how we might do this. Build renewable energy sources, transmission lines, and batteries. Stop heating and cooking with dirty fuels. Learn how to make cement and plastics and steel without spewing carbon dioxide. Replace gas cars with electric vehicles, public transportation, walkable cities. Steward our land more wisely and eat fewer cows. It's a daunting list. Build, stop, learn, replace, steward. So many verbs, and none of them is hope. Someday, my sons will be old enough to understand why their world is changing. Already, the older one is asking me questions. Why did my school flood? Will I ever see a coral reef? How could the grown-ups have let this happen? The gravity of the situation is slowly dawning on him. I try to reassure him. I show him the helpers. I tell him that when he grows up, he will have to help too, and that I believe he will do this well. I almost never tell him that I hope things will get better. I tell him they can. At bedtime, we read stories about heroes and monsters, quests fulfilled against impossible odds. I tell him that to stop climate change, we will have to do something that no one has done before. But that, he knows, is what happens in any story worth telling. So the last thing that I want to read is from the first chapter, which is about wonder. And in this chapter, I talk a little bit about the myth of Cassandra. And for those of you who are not familiar with Greek mythology or don't have 9-year-olds who are obsessed with the Greek myths, the story of Cassandra is a story of a woman who was cursed by Apollo with a terrible, terrible curse. She could see the future and she would always be right, but nobody would ever believe her. So There is an obvious comparison between the mythical Cassandra and modern day climate scientists like me. We see the tragedy that awaits, we try to warn of it. There have been 6 comprehensive climate reports commissioned by the United Nations. There have been 5 US national climate assessments. Over and over, we work unpaid on these things, and when they're released, the news coverage is the same. Scientists concerned about global warming, scientists worried about ice sheets, scientists alarmed by rise in emissions. As if this were a private worry for the scientists, as if everyone else lives on a different planet. And then in the aftermath, nothing happens, at least nothing commensurate with the scale of the problem. This is our curse to shout unheard into the void, to make predictions that can't help but come true, to warn and warn and warn again until the entire world is engulfed in needless, predictable flames. But here's a tiny bit of magic. Our curse is also our gift. The models we use to predict danger and doom also show us amazement and beauty and joy. It's a wonderful thing to watch the future unfold before you, to filter the world through elegant equations until it gives you something that looks an awful lot like prophecy. But to understand the future of the planet, you must understand its present. The hot tropics and freezing poles, the climb of wet air over a damp mountainside, the gentle breeze blowing in from the sea on a hot day. You must sit there for a while, waiting for the world to show you its beautiful and terrible secrets, listening to the now for the faint echoes of futures to come. The gravity that pulls the tired autumn leaves to the ground is the same force that hurls the world around the sun, the motion of every falling leaf a hard promise that spring will come again. It's a gift to be alive, to be able to notice things. We scientists are among the luckiest creatures on Earth. We're allowed to know. Like Cassandra, we see. But the point is not just that Cassandra was ignored, it's that she was right. So, yeah, those are my excerpts. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Kate. It was such a gift to be able to listen to your readings and hear it directly from you. Um, I'm so excited to jump into this book with you. And just as a little note to everyone joining us here today, if you have your own questions for Kate, please feel free to drop them in the Mentimeter that I just put in the chat. But to begin our conversation, throughout the book, I noted that you weaved in stories from humanity's past to help explain how our climate works and how it impacts us. From European witch trials to Emperor Caligula, humans have gone through many phases of trying to make sense of the planet we live on. The theme you came back to was uncertainty, not just in climate science, but in what humans will do with the information we do have about climate change. Knowing these lessons from our past, how do you tolerate uncertainty, especially when coming to terms with the many feelings of living on a changing planet?
Yeah, so the short answer is not very well. I think I, like pretty much all humans, really struggle with the uncertainty. Um, and so I think it's helpful to think of kind of a hierarchy of uncertainties. The science says that the future is uncertain for many reasons. One of those reasons is we've never done this experiment before. We've never kicked the earth this hard. And so there are a lot of feedback processes that we don't really understand how they're going to pan out on a warming planet. We don't understand how clouds are going to rearrange themselves to either trap more heat or block more sun or block less sun. We don't quite understand what's going to happen to the carbon cycle, whether the living things on Earth are going to take up more or less carbon in the future. We think probably less. Um, and so there are these scientific uncertainties, right? And that's what I spend my life studying. Scientists are we can be bad communicators about climate science because we don't want to talk about the stuff that we have understood for over 100 years. We want to talk about the new stuff. We want to talk about the edge of knowledge because that's where we live. That's our job. That's why we go to work every day. And so I think a lot about those uncertainties. But I think it's also important to say that we don't know everything, right? But we don't know nothing. We do know a lot about climate change. We know exactly what is causing it. There is no doubt whatsoever that it is greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, but also methane and nitrous oxide that are causing the planet to warm. No doubt whatsoever. And no doubt whatsoever where those are coming from, the human activities that are putting those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so what the science says is that when we look at the future, we don't know exactly how bad it's going to get. And one of the reasons is we don't know what the Earth is going to do. But the main reason we don't know how hot it's going to get is we don't know what human beings are going to do. We don't know the emissions trajectories that are going to happen in the future. We have some hints right now of what's going to happen. We know that the US is possibly not being the most productive player in the global emission system. Well, definitely not the most productive player, but we do know that the world is transitioning off fossil fuels, not fast enough, not completely enough, but we are seeing little glimmers of the energy transition already in process, already beginning to happen. Most energy analysts think that this transition away from fossil fuels is basically inevitable because fossil fuels are a very stupid way of generating energy. They are a very 20th century technology, and most places are moving to 21st century technologies. Now, does that mean that all is well, that nobody has to do anything? We can just step back and watch this happen? Absolutely not. Because we don't know how fair that's going to be. We can still shape how fast we do this. We can shape who benefits. We can try to remediate harms, and we can try to take action to try to prevent and adapt to the climate changes that are already happening. And so for me, I spend my professional life thinking about one type of uncertainty, but that type of uncertainty that I think about actually isn't the most important uncertainty. The more important uncertainty is what we are going to do. And when that feels overwhelming, I try to think a little bit about my own agency, right? There's this real dichotomy between, all right, well, climate change, do we address that at an individual level and try to drive your individual carbon footprints to zero? Or do we try to do that at a systemic level? And I think that's a false choice, actually, because it can be very, very, very paralyzing to think, oh, I have to reduce my own personal carbon footprint to zero, because that's neither particularly useful in the grand scheme of things, nor particularly possible for the vast majority of us. But then thinking, I can't do anything about climate change unless I am the president of the United States. And by the way, I hope all of you will become president of the United States. You would do a much better job. Or, the Secretary General of the United Nations. That feels very, very, very paralyzing as well. And so the way that I deal with that form of uncertainty is to realize that none of us are individuals, right? The most useful thing that we can do is to not be individuals anymore. We are all plugged into networks. We are all part of communities, neighbors, faith communities, school communities, workplace communities. And so for me, that is, sort of circling back the long way of how I deal with the uncertainty, is knowing that the most uncertainty comes from what we will do and trying to think about what I will do.
That was a wonderful answer, and I love walking through the journey of like how you're navigating that uncertainty. And honestly, that kind of segues nicely into our next question, which is kind of on the theme of hope, just one of the chapters in the book. And throughout the chapter, you explore the theme of history repeating itself. And I think in popular culture, we tend to associate that with like a negative outcome. But I really love that you included some positive outcomes as well. In particular, removing lead from gasoline, the enacting of the Montreal Protocol. And while these are really hopeful like instances for us to lean on, for folks who in particular like don't work in climate, or maybe they're not in these communities yet, how do we help them like how do we not confuse hope with ignorance that like everything will sort itself out? Because I think I can run into that when we do have these like beacons of like really great examples. That like I think there's, if you're not familiar with all the different ways you can act, it can be a little hard. So yeah, how do we assure those who think, yeah, we've come back from the brink before, we'll do it again? How do we not confuse hope with ignorance?
Yeah, I think a lot about that sort of old canonical story where there is a guy who's shipwrecked and he's drowning and he prays for help. And a boat comes along and offers to rescue him. And he says, no, 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 I've prayed to God. God will save me. And then another boat comes along and he says, no, 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 I've prayed to God. God will save me. And then another boat comes along and he says, no, 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 I've prayed to God to save me. And then he drowns and he goes to heaven. He says, God, what gives? Like, I prayed to you and you didn't save me. And God says, what are you talking about? I sent 3 boats. And so for me, that's very illustrative of, what we face right now. We can avoid the worst. We can prevent the absolutely most devastating effects of climate change. And I think we can build a better society in the process. But can is not the same thing as will. And I think it's important to sort of navigate that space where we say, look, we're not doomed. Not all hope is lost. We actually can have a future that we can look forward to. But we have to do something to get there. We can't just sort of lay back passively and expect it to be given to us. And so that's how I kind of navigate those things. But I think it is important to talk about success stories, to not just talk about all of the collapse of civilizations and the terrible things and the wars and the failures, even though we don't deny those things. Those things exist in human history. But I think it's also important to talk about things like the Clean Air Act, right? The Clean Air Act has saved millions of lives. It has made the air so much cleaner. It has made, the Clean Water Act has made our waterways so much cleaner. Our world is better for the passage of this legislation. Now, was this legislation the end all and be all? We passed that and now everything is perfect? Absolutely not. But just because there is more work to do doesn't mean we can't celebrate the work that has already been done. And so I'm a huge fan of the Clean Air Act. I'm a huge fan of the Montreal Protocol. A lot of times people ask me, oh, what happened to the hole in the ozone layer? And the very short answer is, well, we fixed it. It's still there, but it's recovering. And we fixed it because we had a concerted international agreement to ban ozone depleting substances. And I think it's really important to tell those stories, not because they are inevitable, not because they are a perfect analog for what we need to do now, but to kind of illustrate the fact that human beings are complex. We're a very complicated species. And I think there can be this tendency to sort of say, oh, human nature, we're selfish, we're bad, we'll never do this. And we are selfish and bad, but we're also generous and good. And holding that complexity is, I think, really important to thinking about where we go from here.
Thank you so much for addressing the complexity that is living on this planet. And I think something that I really love to transition us into is the chapter on grief. You describe grief both as the recognition of the loss of something beautiful and the challenges of accepting change. You describe how complex it is to process grief, especially when you aren't there to witness it. The story you share of our elder sequoias is one of grieving their anticipated loss in the California that exists in your memory. When the pain of losing something beautiful intertwines with the difficulty in accepting life moving forward, why do you continue to grieve?
Well, I think you continue to grieve because you have felt joy. If you don't grieve something, it means that it didn't matter. And so for me, the grieving process is a way of honoring what mattered, what was really very important. Climate grief is very different, I think, from almost all forms of grief because it is both abstract and concrete. It's so total, but it's also so specific. And different people will experience it in very different ways. I think we have to be very careful, going back to your sort of previous questions. We can't let climate grief become climate despair. Because for me, grief is more active. Grief is saying, this was important, this mattered, I loved this. Whereas despair is saying nothing matters, and there is nothing we can do. And I think I personally have to be very careful about treading that line. Um, I think, the grief chapter was actually the hardest one for me to write, because there are stories from my life, the griefs that I have felt. Most of them do not tie neatly into climate change. They're kind of the normal griefs that we experience going through human life. And then there are also things that I didn't feel like were my stories to share. And so I was really scared and worried writing the grief chapter that maybe there wasn't enough grief, there wasn't enough badness in there. And I was at the time probably spending too much time on social media, and I was afraid that I would be accused of, being callous, being privileged, not feeling what I ought to feel. And so for me, that was a delicate balance to strike, where I felt compelled to share more than I thought was appropriate to kind of demonstrate that no, I do have I have felt grief. I have felt sad. I do have something to talk about. But in the end, I kind of decided that I didn't, there were things that I did not want to share. There were things that I didn't want to put there because it felt more private. It felt like it needed to be private. And I didn't want to use those feelings, which are still kind of raw and unprocessed. I didn't feel like I needed to use them to demonstrate that I had felt enough to be able to write with authority on this.
No, that's incredible. And it is that kind of feeds on the next question, because one thing Julie and I were talking about a lot is, when you're in the climate science field, there is the default to not lean into those emotions, to not, to be indifferent so that you can be objective in the work that you're doing and the research that you're leading. Um, and if it's okay with the group, I want to share a quick quote. This is what particularly stuck out to Julie and myself. This was in the introduction, and Dr. Marvel writes, "Aren't researchers supposed to be perfectly objective, unemotional, and neutral about the world we study? I can't be. I need to declare a conflict of interest regarding Earth. Everyone I love lives here, but I do worry that by saying this, I'll leave myself vulnerable to attack, maybe even undermine climate science more broadly." With that in mind, and the fact that you took the courage to write this book, what advice do you have for a climate scientist? Either those like in their careers, but also those just starting out in the field, so that they can stay in touch with these emotions and not numb out, which has, I think, been the previous default within that culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to come out as humans, right? We need to say we're scientists, but we're human beings as well. And when we pretend we are perfectly objective, neutral science robots, somehow we think that's going to make us more believable, right? That's going to make us more credible. And I don't think that makes us more credible, because that makes us liars. And I don't think lying about how you feel is a good way to sort of make people believe that what you're saying is true. I think that there is no necessarily split between the facts and the feelings, right? You can get the facts right. I am a physicist. The equations are what they are. The math is what it is. You can get the math right and at the same time acknowledge your feelings about the changes that are described by that math. And so I think it is really important to do both. We have sort of set up this false dichotomy where either you know the facts or you don't know the facts and you supersede those with your feelings. And I think that's very, very silly. I think you can know the facts and you can have feelings about them, and you can acknowledge all of that. I believe that human beings are capacious enough to be able to do two things at once.
It's important to take it all together. I think that's a lot we talk about, like, you can't turn off that wall when you're like at work versus like at home, and it's all intertwined. Sorry, Jill, I saw you unmute there.
No, it's all good. Yeah. Just echoing that same sentiment. And I am wanting to shift gears a little bit, take us a little bit on a bigger picture scale. But before I do that, just wanted to put out a reminder to everyone that if you have your own questions for Dr. Marvel, we'll get to those very soon. Feel free to submit them to the Mentimeter, which is the link I just sent in the chat. You can write your own questions. You can also upvote questions that maybe you see and you want to hear yourself. So putting that short reminder, but before we move into Q&A, I wanted to ask, since human nature guides the reader through these various feelings that can arise as citizens of our planets, how did you decide on the order of the chapters? How did you land on the 9 emotions? Were there any emotions that didn't make the cut?
Yeah, so the emotions are the 9 emotions that I could think of at the time that I wrote the book proposal. I am not claiming that these are the only 9 emotions that anyone can feel. But what I wanted to do is sort of write the book as a trajectory. You know, each chapter has a scientific component, an emotional component, and then kind of a historical or mythical or sort of story component to it. And the way that it fell out, I think, tells a bit of an arc, where we start out with wonder, basically the the recognition of how incredible it is that we know anything at all about this world. For me, as a scientist, that is really something that just staggers me every day, how beautiful this world is, how garbage all of the other planets are, and how incredible it is that we can know anything about it. And then that for me led directly into anger. So the anger chapter is about the history of kind of the discovery of global warming, climate change, which is intertwined with the history of other people lying about it. And that for me was sort of a natural progression. The guilt chapter is about attribution, basically, how we know that it is us, how we know it's not a natural phenomenon, how we know it's not, natural cycles or a volcanic eruption or anything like that, and then how we should feel about that. And then the fear chapter, which was next, was kind of, well, what does this actually mean? What does climate change, a rise in the temperature of, 2 degrees Celsius? That doesn't sound like a lot. What does it actually mean? Well, it means more energy in the climate system, which means longer and stronger heat waves. It means downpours and droughts at the same time. It means fire weather. It means rising seas. And for me, the natural emotion was fear. And that led me to grief, which was understanding that these changes are already happening. We are already 1.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. We are not going to get no climate change. We're already seeing these changes. And then that, thinking about that led me to surprise, like, what are the things that we still don't know? And then pride, kind of starting out with the hubris of, well, could we hack the planet? Could we block the sun? Could we geoengineer our way out of this? And then ending up with the sort of simple pride in a job well done. Well, if we reduce emissions, we'll all have a place in that. And I think there is space for us to be proud about that, which then led naturally to hope. And I wanted to end with love, which is the most personal chapter of the book, but I think is also the most motivating emotion, not just for me, but for many other people, right? You try to shame people, you try to make people afraid, you try to make people very sad. A lot of times they shut down. But if you try to figure out what people love, that is a great conversation starter. And that's something that I think connects us all. And a lot of people who say that they're motivated to act on climate are motivated by love for their surrounding world, for their children, for future generations, for their community.
That's absolutely wonderful. Resonated deeply with myself, and um, so I don't love the conversation between like the mountains versus the city, and like it all, like you all find those pockets of like joy and love wherever you are. Now, I wanted to ask a quick question for those who haven't read the book yet. This is a tiny spoiler. There's a wonderful like underwriting theme of movies throughout the book, and you share your love of movies. And so we had to ask, like, are there any climate movies you do recommend? Any that do spark joy? I do share a distaste of The Day After Tomorrow as well. And then also, have you gotten any calls from Hollywood yet on your own proposal for a climate movie?
Sadly, no. Although I do think somebody should make it. But yeah, I don't think that Hollywood writ large or storytellers, and I should stress that I'm a fan mostly of bad movies. I like terrible action movies. I like trashy rom-coms. And I think the sort of bad movie complex has not really figured out how to deal with climate change because it's all disaster all the time, right? You know, the New York collapses and The Rock comes in and saves everything. Or, you know, Dennis Quaid is the only scientist in America and he breaks Antarctica and then terrible things happen. And I think, you know, I understand why they do that, right? It's cinematic, it's exciting, you can, you know, put it on a big screen. Um, but I think it doesn't do justice to the ways in which climate change just affects every aspect of life, right? Um, Climate change is a change in the background state of everything that happens on this planet. And so I would love to see more of that incorporated in storytelling. I would love to see more climate solutions incorporated in storytelling, right? Like Fast and Furious public transit, like go make that. And you know, I think that there is a poverty of ways in which we can talk about climate change. And I think sort of pop culture has has an important place in sort of leading that and helping us think about new ways to talk about this. My colleague, Catherine Hayhoe, who is this incredible climate scientist and communicator, she makes the point that the most effective thing we can do about climate change as individuals is to talk about it. Because if you look at the surveys, if you look at the polling, the vast majority of people, even in America, are concerned or alarmed about climate change and support action on climate change. But something that's even more interesting is that most people wildly underestimate how many other people are concerned or alarmed about climate change. And so most people are going through life thinking, I'm really concerned about this and I would like to see something done about it, but I am the only one. Nobody else cares about this. And when you start talking about it, you realize that, oh, many, many, many other people care about this. And when I'm told that nobody cares about climate, that's maybe not actually true. We just don't know how to talk about it and we don't know how to talk to each other about it.
Thank you so much for sharing all your incredible wisdom when it came to this book and all that you've learned in your journey as a climate scientist, as a parent, as a human on this planet. Um, I'm going to stop the recording so that we can move into the Q&A section.